This morning I spoke by telephone to the Harbour Constable of Cheek Point in County Waterford, Mr. Sean Doherty. During the next 45 minutes, Sean will explain by telephone the past, the present and the future of the heritage fisheries in the Waterford Estuary.
Morning, Brendan.
Good morning, Sean. How's it going there?
Not too bad, not too bad. Quite enough.
Okay, Sean, tell us about Cheek Point and the history of fishing in Cheek Point.
Well, Brendan, I suppose the history of fishing Cheek Point goes back to recorded history. I think the first mention is, around 700 years ago of fishing here. And, unfortunately, there's always been fishing here until today.
Right.
Basically, there was three main fisheries in the summertime: salmon, obviously, the eel fishery and the bass. They're all banned, and the herring fishery and the codling fishery in the winter time, they were a mainstay. You also then had shellfish.
Mm-hmm.
So, you had three type of boat there. You had the traditional punts, which kind of stroke yawl, which were, under sail and oars. And later on then you had the motors came in, and the half-deckers, and you had a boat called a prong, which was predominantly built on the River Barrow, but there was some of them used in Cheek Point. But it sustained the place through wars and famine, and there was always something to look forward to. There was always hope that next year might be a better season. It was never a fishery that people accumulate great wealth or anything. You could say it was a subsistence fishery in some matters, but there was a great connection to it, because people appreciated and were told the stories that during the famine, that things like the fish weirs, kittle fish it was called, a kettle of fish, basically herons and sprats and flounder fish that wouldn't be very, very expensive or probably even marketable, but those were in high demand. So, as long as you go back, fishing was part of the scene here,
Mm-hmm. And tell us what has happened over the last 20 or 30 years. In your view, what has happened?
Well, in my view, one of the worst things that happened was the uncontrolled fishing at sea for salmon. I think everyone admits at this stage that was overdone. So the salmon got hammered, and less and less runs coming back to the rivers.
Mm-hmm.
And then, unfortunately, what you had, it was an us against them system was portrayed, from the anglers who tried to put themselves forward as being the goodies. Mm-hmm. We had all this thing then, a fish caught by a rod was worth 500, and a fish caught by a fisherman was worth a tenner.
Right.
And it was very, very unfair, because, previous, I suppose, up to the early years of the Irish state, salmon was fairly well managed.
Right.
There was always cases of fellas being prosecuted for poaching, but it was a small thing. It wasn't very big, but it had always gone on, and I suppose a certain amount of it was tolerated. But the fishery, it was well managed. It opened on a date, it closed on a date. That was fair.
Mm-hmm.
It closed for the weekend. There was a length on the nets. There was a depth on the nets. The advantage was with the fish. So when the Irish Department of Marine legalised mass fishing, this film followed then that there was no regulation really.
Right.
They were paying the Navy to go around and take monofilament nets off fishermen and prosecute them, but yet the state was taking VAT on the sale of the same nets.
Right.
And it became, and to this day, you could say that the politics of salmon in this country is a complete and utter joke. Mm-hmm. Again, this year it's been announced that there's no fishery here on the shore in the Barrow. We're now nearly 15 years without a fishery, and yet a species that's supposed to be under threat is allowed to be fished for sport.
Right.
And as we all know, catch and release, there's questions with it. Not all fish survive. The effect that it has on fish isn't calculated. And there's a kind of an unwritten law that was in the commercial sector. Asher, one for the pot, won't do any bother. So every angler seems to have this sense of entitlement. We'll get a fish or two. There was quotas for salmon. There was no quota on the number of anglers. So you had one side that was totally open-ended,
Mm-hmm.
and we had the quota for the commercial fishermen that was being reduced the whole time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it became, with tags and quotas
mm-hmm.
and cutting of the season, it became obvious that it was never about management. It was about closing the fishery. And I think, after 15 years, the question has to be asked. Inland Fisheries Ireland, since it was created, has closed every fishery. They've all been closed. It's not about management. If I was a farm manager, I would put it this way, and I had three occupations on a farm, and we'll just say salmon, bass, and eels, and three of them were closed because there was none of them seemed to be commercial. I think I'd be fairly moved on fairly soon, and we get in somebody else to have a go at it, because I think it's well accepted that bass are in abundance along the coast. I know of a case where lads, got tens of bass in a day on rods, and yet we're told they're in decline and we can't have a fishery. The salmon, science says it's under conservation limits in these rivers. We can't fish. But eels is over conservation limit, and they still became. So we have complete opposites there in the management of the thing. And there seems to be undoubtedly the policy there to remove the fisheries. And I have to say that it appears from fairly obvious at this stage that the powers that be will not tackle industrial pollution or damage. And I think a classic example of that, if people follow Facebook, the old River Shannon, Dr. Will O'Connor has been for years, if not a decade now, highlighting Anna Crotty Weir on the Shannon about the slaughter of eels and turbines and salmon and smalls, trout. Nobody's doing anything. It's the same here. We have issues with industries on the shore. And on every occasion, Inland Fisheries Ireland and Fisheries, when they're contacted, including the SFPA, they all see no problem. The same likewise with SFPA. But if you mirror that then with, say, traditional fishermen, where you have blanket enforcement, where you have resources that you will only see in the United States, where you have high-powered 4x4 vehicles, covert cameras, camouflage gear, you name it, they have it. To follow a few men who are now mostly, the young lads are in their late 50s, and the zero tolerance, actually impossible to walk down a boreen down onto a strand now without somebody approaching you and asking you what are you doing if you're a fisherman, because the intelligence that they have of their files and hotspots and people of interest and all this thing. Gangland in Dublin wouldn't have the same follow-up on them. So it's to push people away from it. And you have to ask why. Because if you take the real value of salmon, we hear about this fish that's worth so much money to the economy. But yet in Carrick-on-Suir, in summer when the salmon are there, you would not get a sheet of paper between the anglers stretched up along the rivers. The hotels are not renting out rooms. Mm-hmm. There's no anglers coming there. By and large, most angling shops in Ireland are under pressure because everything is coming in by order from internet. So it's an illusion, the figures that IFI are putting forward. I'd actually go and say they're false. And they were questioned on Sean O'Rourke's show one morning when the person in IFI were putting them forward, asked them to verify them, because they're not genuine audited figures. The real truth about the salmon is, if you look at it from a system where we had here up until the 70s, there was basically a necklace of communities around the coast and the rivers that fish salmon in small, sustainable ways. Mm-hmm. And that put great annual income into little villages. It gave people something to look forward to. Elderly men fished into their 80s and 90s in some cases.
Yeah.
There's even cases of men who had lost their sight who continued fishing, being put into a boat and being able to haul nets. So the well-being of the community, the sense of purpose, your heritage, you pass it on. You know, people, I suppose, in Ireland at times get frustrated with the travelling community. But if you look at the history, there was a day when they were basically nomads, where the roads of Ireland was theirs. There was no traffic, and they had a way of life. And what have become of them when you remove everything that people have and you say, well, you don't belong anymore. And that's how it feels to a lot of traditional fishermen who can go back multiple generations. They feel the state doesn't value us. They discriminate against us and they cheat us. And I think, without doubt, 100%, it's the only method of acceptable racism in Ireland today. A man's skin, his religion, or where he comes from, you could not make a judgment on that. But in fishing, if you're a commercial fisherman, you can be discriminated against. You can have a board like Inland Fisheries Ireland, where fishermen won't be represented. Mm-hmm. But yet, everyone from the angler, the hotelier, the farmer, to some vaguely relevant person will be represented. But you will not have a fisherman. Likewise, flag in these things. Yeah. I really cannot understand, how European money is put into things like flag, and is vaguely described as coastal communities. But yet when European money is put into agricultural projects, you have to be a farmer, a landowner. You have to have a herd number to gain it. But with money for fisheries, you can have a hotel on the top of a mountain 40 miles from the sea, and someone will say it's a coastal community. So I think, education is part of it, but discrimination is very hard to overcome when it's endemic. Everything from IFI, Inland Fisheries, to the department. The classic example is the eel fishery.
Yeah.
Our eel fishery is the only one in Europe closed. It's an embarrassment to the scientists now who closed it, because they thought they were going to be followed by the Dutch and the Germans and the Belgians and the French. But sure, as anyone knows, the Dutch would never close down eel fisheries. It's too much part of their heritage. They have festivals, they smoke their eels, they manage it. I've continued to fish eels every year, to take some eels just to monitor it. And I have friends in Holland who bought eels off us, and they cannot believe the amount of eels that we have here compared to what's there. So it's not about conservation. Unfortunately, like in a time where a lot of emphasis on pollution and on environmental impact, it looks very, very like the fishermen are removed because they're the eyes and ears of what's really going on. They see too much. They've been there too long. They understand what's going on. You're talking about people who have fished salmon, who've lived by the salmon, very much like the Native America did, and the First Nations salmon people in the Pacific Northwest and in other areas. They've lived by the salmon for centuries and centuries. They understand it. But you cannot understand when major multinational companies and international companies can pollute and can have impact, and yet the only person that is subject to having his rights removed is the person who would probably, in a more progressive society, be seen as an indigenous person, people who were there possibly 7, 8, maybe 1,000 years of recorded history of the same families. And the interesting thing about salmon and eels is that from hundreds of years back, there was always records kept of salmon. And the scientists know that salmon, times of great bounty were followed by times of great scarcity. It just always happened for some reason. They know that. They know that there was years of Shannon, very few salmon returned. So people understand that, bad times and good times. But what they can't understand is that your rights are taken away for 15 years. That the people that take them away say, well, we'll have a sport fishery every year and we'll have a catch and release, but nod, wink, wink. Every angler gets to keep a salmon or two or 3 or 4. But if a commercial person goes out, he'll have to be told before a judge and made an example of. So it's not that it's unfair. It's I would say we have to start using that there's an element of racism there. There's an element of discrimination there, and it's perpetrated by the state. And unfortunately, the state, we will have to probably go outside the state to, personally, I would like to see an independent, international inspectorate just come to Ireland and see the money that has been spent on fisheries and the value to the communities. In 30 years, we've lost every boat yard nearly, bar a couple. We've lost all our heritage, all our history is under serious, serious threat. It's not valued. And yet, under the Irish Constitution, everybody is supposed to be treated equally. So the very future of fishing in Ireland is at stake, Brendan.
Just with regard to the environmental impact, etc., there's a lot of talk about a marine protected area being implemented in the Waterford Estuary with a so-called heritage fishery. And just in your view, tell us, what do you think a heritage fishery should look like in the Waterford Estuary?
Well, personally, I'd be very fearful of these coastal management zones because up until now, every piece of legislation that the Irish state introduced, I think somebody looks at it and says, how can we screw the fishermen a little bit more? So first of all, with groups like Coast Watch and the Department of Marine and IFI and that, I'd be very fearful. But certainly, if there was a willingness there, and it's hard to see when the people involved are excluded from it, I think you have to mirror these villages with other villages similar. Cornwall comes to mind, communities in the Pacific Northwest, Canada, New Zealand and that. So in the estuary, like what we had different types of boats. We had different fisheries, small scale fisheries, sustainable fisheries. We had all these magnitude of different skills from oars, sails, net making, net repairs, fish weirs that went back over 1,000 years of recorded history, 10,000 years, sorry. The oldest method of fishery still in operation in Europe. So if you have a heritage fishery model, you say, well, if you have a weir fishery there that basically uses the tide to catch fish, how wonderful. You don't need to burn diesel. You don't need to have any mechanism to catch fish, and they're still in operation. So you incorporate, I believe, these into main ones like of well-being of the community continuity. What are these communities? I mean, if the vision is that all the locals pack up and leave because by some freak of nature, all these poor people from fishing communities manage to wind up living overlooking the river or the sea, and now we can get a better class of people to come in and buy up all the sites and all the houses, and we'll remove the indigenous people. That's the way they're going. And along the strand here, every little area strand had a name. Most of the significant stones had a name, because they all had relevant points. Like we had stones here like the half-tide rock, the yellow rock, the white stone, and then you had like different areas of mud, Ned and Nelch's mud, Moran's poles, with all these names. And without them being used, they're lost. And it's no use having them written down in a book, I don't believe. And someone coming along and saying, oh, this is called Moran's poles. It has a reason. It's the same as like Cheek Pine Pier. It has a reason. So to add in the story of the place, the people, and then more importantly, the food. Like in Ballyhack, there's one example. Ballyhack Smokehouse, Mickey de Winch's smoked salmon.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that could be built on. We could have wild Atlantic salmon smoked in the estuary. We could have eel smoked here. We could have bass. I actually once, a man gave me a smoked bass that he'd done.
Mm-hmm.
And it was delicious. I never had it before or since. And as I say, like, all these could be marketed. They don't have to be in big numbers. Some years ago, I was out there, one of the programs that Kevin Dundon was making, and he said that he'd love to be able to market the fish out of the estuary because it's not the quantity, it's the story.
Mm-hmm.
So if you go out today and you haul a couple of tramolets and you get 2 sole and half a dozen codlin, and a lobster or something, and that's on a menu, you won't get it tomorrow. But if it's marketed properly, the next day it could be a bass, it could be a salmon. So, like, this is whereas the fear of what is coastal management zone, there'll be another turn of the screw. And people, unfortunately, the young people are being targeted to think where they come from is wrong. Like, fishing is bad, aquaculture is good, and yet it's the other way around in reality. You know, salmon in cages are bad, really bad for everybody.
Yeah.
The wild salmon, at the time of year it comes in, is good for you. And, you know, I watch a lot of programs there, documentaries about Native American, and they felt it very, very important for their health to eat the salmon because it was in their DNA.
Yeah.
And apparently in Ireland, why we have so much diabetes is because we starved during the famine. And here we have villages where generations of people ate salmon. You know, they ate salmon. And now you have, I done it myself, I'm not ashamed to say it, elderly people, terminally ill, and they asking people, is anyone getting me a bit of salmon? And it had to be smuggled to them as if it was a Class A drug. You know, it was even said off the altar above him faith, like a man had died. You know, his dying wish, and a man got it for him, was to get him a feed of salmon. I mean, I think that's shocking when it's come to that.
Yeah.
So, like, the heritage fishery has so much potential because, like, you know, if it's done right, you know, you have Dunmore East lobster, you can come at it from the sustainable point of view, you know, all you want, you can manage the fishery, but if you have the story of it and people feel good that, look at this fishery, small scale, it's sustainable, you know, there's a story attached to it. And I don't have to be the storyteller. It can be another person can get the job in the storytelling. But I think, like, when you go into Dunmore East and you go into a hotel and you want a lobster, the very least you should be able to get is a little card on your plate, the same as they have in Cornwall and these places. www. Waterford Estuary Heritage Fishery. Lobster caught by John Smith, Dunmore East Heritage Fishery.
Yeah.
5th generation. Little story of the food, the story of the boat, story of the village. And people would say, well, isn't that grand? I think that's the boat we saw coming in this morning. Otherwise, we're getting fish in at this stage. Our busiest ports as our airports. Fishing has gone from a stage where it was respected and it has been criminalised by the government. Everything to do with it has been criminalised. And, like, I mean, when you look at IFI and the former fishery boards and BIM, every one of them had a watch and they all failed. And they all failed the industry.
Yeah.
They all failed future generations. They've all sold out. You know, decommissioning votes off the register, I think, is another act of treason because, like, when we were young, you could, if you had a few pounds for a deposit, you could go to BIM, you could get your boat, and you sank or you swam. Pardon the pun.
Yeah.
If you didn't succeed, that was it. Just you had the option to sell the boat and move on. But you didn't have an option. I should look at, we'll sell it out and we'll get a salmon buyout or we'll get decommissioning and there'll be nothing for no one else. Like, how did we come from a stage in Ireland with fisheries that it was there for everyone to it was only there for a few? You know, quotas have been a disaster that way. I mean, a few multimillionaires have all the quota and then after that then there's nothing. And in these villages, like, you know, a box of codling a day would be good fishing for us. You know, you fish maybe 10 days before the tides are gone. You have 10 boxes of codling. It used to be like if you had a few boxes of codling, if you got a few bass on top of it, it topped it up because the bass, the last year we sold bass on the auction in Dunmore East, we got £5, old Irish money, a pound for them. You know, and today we have more bass than ever was there. The bass, like, I've never seen the like of bass that I saw being caught this year. I can look straight across here at an area where there's always angling, and the amount of bass that's there, you could say, like, they're as thick as the grass. And we have, so a heritage fishery could do so much for tourism, well-being, education, but I fear what will be done is that they'll get areas maybe like Tramore Bay or up along the coast and to say, well, you can't trawl you can't gill net.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, trawling took place in this village, particularly in Passage in these areas, for hundreds of years. Apparently the Kilmore net originated in the Waterford Estuary. The nets were brought down to Kilmore, and they were copied in Kilmore, and obviously they had better fishing grounds and they became more commonly known as a Kilmore net. But then at one stage, and it was in Cardigan in Wales, I was told this story, the French noticed that the Kilmore men were out fishing them. So one of them came into Kilmore at some stage and bought a net, and they went back to France and they copied it. So most of the nets originate out of these areas.
Yeah.
And people might laugh at you today, but I remember trawling, with 45 horsepower, and we hauling the net by hand, and we, fishing for sole and slips. And the foot rope we had on it, was old salmon. It's bound around. We used to use the manila rope because manila rope was soft. It would absorb the water and to stay on the ground. It wouldn't last very long, but if it was bound right, it would, last a bit longer.
Mm-hmm.
And those nets had no impact. And sure, even like the 50-footers and, with a single net, they had no impact on the river bottom. One dredger would do more damage in an hour than they wouldn't do for 10 lifetimes. And yet we have this thing, trawling is bad for the environment. We'll have to ban trawling. We had to ban drift netting. We've had to ban everything because it's bad for the environment. The people that's looking to have it banned, do they actually know what they're talking about? I mean, I was part of several litter cleanups, and the whole emphasis, some of the people had was marine litter that came from fishing. And I'd have to say 99% of the marine litter that I ever saw, and I collected a lot of it, was industrial, milk cartons, oil drums, plastic bags, plastic ties. Very, very little of it was netting or a fisherman's glove. Very little. I'd say about 5% at the very most was it. So 95% was either domestic or industrial. But the whole emphasis was fishing was bad. Now, obviously, when you go into the coast, you get a little bit more because it tends to wash up a bit more. But it's still only a tiny percentage of the overall problem.
Mm-hmm.
So, there is, I think, all around the coast, there is so much potential for a heritage fishery. You look at the Shannon, there were still men fishing in currachs for salmon up to 15 years ago, when the Irish state thought to be a great idea to ban it. And nobody thought this could be one of the greatest marketing jewels ever known, a wild Irish smoked salmon caught in a currach that St. Brendan, the navigator, found America in. Oh, Jesus, it doesn't make sense. This is gold dust to America, and they cannot see it. But it has to be mirrored now in more serious times, because when you look at the impact and the devastation in the communities, and not just the devastation from a personal thing, but there was social thing where the fabric has broken down. We had 3 lorries used to come here. I believe there was 4 at one stage. We had Carl from Cork, we had Michael O'Neill, and we had Johnny Whittle. They came here for generations, collecting salmon, delivering an income to the community. And everything from some people back before mobile phones, most people hadn't a phone, there was little signs put up. There'd be the brick. One man up the road here had a brick. If he had salmon, he put the brick on top of the pier. There was other people put up a white towel. They'd have fish. So if he was driving down the lorry, down in the little van, he could look in and see if there was fish. And this went around all the villages, Passage, Chick Point, Dunmore East. There was a little bit of money being dropped off. And at that time, common sense was king. Nylon nets was always allowed. And in Dunmore at the time, it was UR19s, I think about 12 or 14 nets was the normal length of net. And it was managed. You had to haul out your net on a Friday evening, and you haul them in at 6 o'clock on a Monday morning. But then the experts came in and they made a mess of it all.
Yeah.
And politicians was mainly to blame. But you had everything from young lads, 7 or 8, up to old fellas in their 90s fishing, you had a bit of income, the well-being. And then when you look at today, we're after having horrendous tragedies, and it's there on the public record. The roots of these tragedies lay in fishery politics. Now, if you had a family lost in an agricultural setting, and someone said it was the minister's decision to make them stop doing what they were doing, and they were forced to do that, that minister would lose his job. Especially if that tragedy was mirrored by several more, he would lose his job because his policy was had to be improved to have him costing people their lives. And that's what's happened. We've had the Bulger brothers, we've had John Flynn, we've had so many of them now rolling on that from people who were forced to do things that in an ideal situation, previously you had a situation where especially the salmon fishery and the herring fishery, both were close together. There was a community there. People were forced to go outside their comfort zone for to fish on their own, and the inevitable happened. So the well-being and you go down Jig Point now, a passage, and a kind of an overcast day, and people say there's something wrong in the villages. There's an air of there's an air of depression, and you see what is the response. The greenway is great and all this. They are great, but you have to remember there was greenways in Dunmore East and Chick Point and Passage. 1,000 years ago, people walked along the coast. They walked from bay to bay and and it was cove men that basically walked those ways, or people with a cow or a couple of goats, and it was the way of life for the people. So, there's a saying, Native Americans say, on our graves you build your cities. Is the greenways along the coast going to be built on the graves of the fishermen? Because to me anyway, we used to go to Dunmore every Sunday, and you went down to see what boats were in, and you'd know the lads was there and what they were doing, and it was of interest. Whereas now it reminds me a bit of Holt. If you talk to anyone fishing, there's an air of, it's not that it's bet, they have it finished. You just need to see the resources the SFPA have up at the top and what's happening for the fishermen at the bottom. There's a big, big chasm there, and you mirror that with what's going on in farming. The support for farms goes directly to farmers. Support for fishermen, they don't.
Yeah.
So that's what I think. I think there's great potential, but I'd be fearful that it'll be used as a tool that people thought this will be great, we'll have some protection. I think it'll be used against them,
Sean, tell us, what do you envisage for our fishing villages and fishing communities for the next 25 years of the 21st century? Can you give us your vision of the future?
Well,
have you got a crystal ball? I
think if you're pessimistic, you give up. I think if you look at possibly we have to be at the lowest ebb now. To look at it from, say, a fatalist point of view, it'll all be gone. There might be one or two boats in Dunmore East. There'll be a fleet of Belgian beamers landing there. You go down the quay, you won't even know the language they're speaking. So the villages of Chig Point and Passage and that fishing will be completely gone, the whole lot. But if you look at it, say, from a positive, and there was real interest, because the money is there. If Flag and Leader and that weren't so hell-bent on wasting money, instead of saying, well, look at what can we really do? We have key drivers here. We have a tradition, we have heritage, we have the people. What can we do with it? If honesty came into fisheries policies, and I think that the best way would be to say, well, look, the fishermen just don't believe the figures that the like of IFI. So if you got independent people to do counts on the fish and say, well, right, there is a surplus there. What can we do with it?
Yeah.
We want the like of Ballyhack Smokehouse caught by Sean and smoked by Michael and sold by Brendan. We want that approach. I say, yeah, that's grand. The fishermen never had a problem with that. That would work great. So you say then, well, what about the boats? The boats are all going. Ballyhack, the last few traditional Waterford yawls have been smashed up. they're unsightly looking. They don't look good to the visitor, unfortunately, when we hear that. You know, boats that had reared families for years and were repaired and were loved, part of the family, all of a sudden, because of a policy by a minister who hadn't a clue what he was doing, all been lost. So to rebuild the thing, to say, well, right, you know, we gradually go back to wooden boats and the skills that was there. You know, we'll carry things like oars that we carried before, a little foresail on the boats, things that could be done that's not going to get in your way because you're small scale fishing. And like the same there with the lobsters in Dunmore East, I think, and I haven't ever fished lobsters, but I think that there's a lot of people accept now that it's gone past the point of where the salmon went, that it can't keep going in the one direction, that there have to be some kind of a... But unfortunately, like, there's also fear that if the department come in, or BIM or these come in, they'll chop and change it and it still make it worse. So if, you know, there was a realisation that there's a real cultural heritage being lost on the Shannon, the Suir, the Lee, how do you save it? What was it, first of all? I saw a picture last night of Ardmore, probably in the 80s, of the punts full of herring. And anyone can remember Helvig in the 80s, 70s. You know, small little boats full up of herrings, and they all going for human consumption. And, you know, the salmon fishery that was there and the gillnet fishery was there. You have to get back to that. And the one thing with fishing, it recovers so fast. You know, it will recover. But I think until we bring back common sense, we're in trouble, Brendan, because, like, I don't want to get into the debate of seals as regards cull, but I do want to get into it as regards management. Whether it was for good or bad, there were seals culled in this country for centuries. And you have to compare them to species like deer and foxes and even feral horses. If you leave, no matter how beautiful a species, uncontrollable, horses, say, they will interbreed, they will outnumber, they will destroy the food source, and they will probably eventually become diseased. Other problems arise then. You know, we in the estuary now, and I think IFI privately accept they don't know what to do now. We have seals from Thomastown right down to Dunmore East in their tens of hundreds now at the moment, because the river is particularly populated because of the herons. We have thousands of seals. Salmon will not survive. You would not need fishery officers here to put out a salmon net now, because only a man that's after losing his marbles would put out a net, because what he would get back would be holes. So management has to be reintroduced. The man that managed the salmon was the fisherman, because he acted as a deterrent. It's quite simple, and that's what's frustrating. If you have a chicken coop out the back full of chickens and the fox comes and takes one tonight, well, tomorrow night you go out and try and protect him. And if he comes that night and he managed to take one, well, you'll start getting serious then. You'll have to frighten him off, whether you shoot him or you scare him or you hunt him, but you'll have to get rid of him, otherwise you're gone, your chickens are all gone. So there has to be management of these things.
Right.
And anglers coming back here now and saying, why are the seals there? Why aren't the fishermen managing them? We gone from a stage in my lifetime where fishery officer would come down if there was rogue seals. That's what they're called, rogue seals. If they were taking fish, they were dispatched humanely by a man who was trained in England. Frank Ryan was the fishery officer, and he worked on big estates in management in England. Cormorants the same. They're in their thousands, and I'm not saying go out and shoot them, but I mean in other areas they go out and they shoot the egg they with pelicans, and they reduce the numbers. So, like, if we stand back and we say we leave it the way it is, that's not an option, because the seals will become overpopulated as they are. Eventually, the terrible thing that we're all predicting is going to happen. A seal is going to take a child when swimming. They're coming into the quay here. I couldn't believe it. Seals up on the steps of Chick Point Quay, because there's bait on the quay. They're coming imprinted. A lot of them that are now in the estuaries are reared by sanctuaries, good, well-meaning people, but the seals are imprinted on humans for food. So it will go wrong.
Right.
It's like a bull that you befriend and you start petting and taming. People are told, don't do that, because it backfires eventually. The inshore fishery, there's no whitefish like what was here before.
Right.
In the inshore sector. So they are, after finding in the estuary, well, right, we have a constant supply of salmon. We have some codling. We have salmon going up and down the whole time. But they're hungry a lot of the time. And that's what's going to happen. And, when that happens, the powers that be are going to have to take responsibility, because they are seriously there. So, I think communities in Wales, Cornwall and Ireland, particularly fishing communities who have suffered from discrimination, a form of racism, negligence and just pure ambivalence, need, I think, to start looking at what they are.
Right.
What they want. Do they want to save it? Is it worth saving? And from that, build something. Because, if you keep treating these people like that and take away everything they've been living, there's a line in a Johnny Cash song there: what you do with the man you done wrong by taking everything he's been living by and reject him from society. And that's exactly what BIM and IFI have done. The fishery's been destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a lot of things can be done if the willingness is there. But I think we're going to get to a stage where all the fishermen will be gone, the way of life will be gone, and people say, well, we made a mistake. But I think a terrible beauty has been born as well in the fact that these well-meaning people who are very to the fore in coastal management zones are going to have our inshore waters overpopulated with seals and cormorants that can't be sustained by any species such as salmon or bass or codling, and it will be, and I think that's what people need is education, because any species that's overpopulated and not managed will, they'll decimate the food resource, disease, inbreeding, and then you have the other issues, which will culminate eventually in someday you and I will ring one another and say, did you see about that child was attacked by a seal?
Yeah.
And they'll say, well, the poor seal was sick and he was ill. But it won't be. It'll be just endemic of the problem that they were overpopulated, and that's it. Because they're already there. There's a video there of a seal killing a swan on the Shannon. And I don't want to be going on too much about them, because people love seals, and I can see a certain element, they are cute, but they're a savage beast at the same time.
They're a big animal, yeah. A big unpredictable animal. Yeah. Okay then, Sean. Look, I'll leave you to it. Look forward to talking to you soon. Thanks a lot.
Right, Brendan.
Thanks for that.
Thank you.
God bless.
No bother,
Bye-bye.
Brendan.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.